Welcome, everybody, and welcome to those of you on the line as well. Always good to see a nice full room up there. And as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ohlone Ramaytush. I just want to take a moment to offer our respects to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. So there are those who work in the literary world, and there are those who live it, embody it, and are living repositories of its history and values. And the book we are celebrating tonight is written by someone who is, I think, composed of the latter cloth. Steve Wasserman has been immersed in the literary life and in the world of ideas going back to his formative years. His enthusiasm, his curiosity, and erudition are in plain view in this wonderful new book that we're featuring tonight. So I think it can be truly said that he has lived a life of letters. He has served as a deputy editor of the LA Times, editor of the Los Angeles Times Book Review, also editorial director of New Republic Books. He was a publisher and editorial director at Hill and Wang. Also, he's served at different agencies, literary agencies, and representing many notable authors. And moreover, really forming wonderful friendships with many of these people. People like Christopher Hitchens, Susan Sontag, Linda Ronstadt, Robert Scheer, who used to work at City Lights and was also just down the street as, major domo over at Ramparts magazine. So Mr. Wasserman was the principal architect of the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. Currently, he is the publisher of Heyday Books. He is a cultural essayist and social critic of the First Order. So the book we are celebrating this evening is called Tell Me Something, Tell Me Anything, Even If It's a Lie, a memoir and essays. And I'm hoping you will talk a little bit about the title, because there's a wonderful story that goes with that title. So it showcases 30 outstanding essays originally published in such diverse publications as the New Republic, The Nation, The American Conservative, The Progressive, The Village Voice, and many, many others. And it really reveals the depth and breadth of his enthusiasms and range over politics, art, film, literature, and so on. And they really reveal a life immersed in devotion to the written word. So we are very honored to have with him tonight Adam Hochschild. He is an author, journalist, historian, and lecturer. Best known works include King Leopold's Ghost, To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, Bury the Chains, Prophets and Rebels in the Fight to Free and Empire Slaves, amongst others. He has written for The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, The Atlantic, and many, many others. Gentlemen, such an honor to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and welcome to all of you who are in the room and who are watching online from all over the country and possibly elsewhere in the world. So it's a pleasure for me to be here with Steve, whom I've known for more than 30 years, and I'm now neighbors with him and Mina in Berkeley. And it was a real pleasure for me to read this book because in many ways, I feel our lives have overlapped. We were both sort of children of the 60s. In a way, you were an adolescent of the 60s, while I was a sort of very young man of the 60s, because I'm a couple years older. But I somehow have the feeling in reading the book that the 60s stamped you as they did me. Because you were in high school at the time of the free speech movement in Berkeley, right? And then going to school there at the time of the tremendous upsurge of agitation against the Vietnam War. And I think all of us who lived through those years, those events had an enormous effect on us and brought us in one way or another into the American left. So here we are 50, 60 years later. Do we still have a left in this country? Let's start there.
Well, first, let me say how thrilled I am to be part of this conversation with you, Adam, and with all of you listening, both virtually and in other countries, apparently, as well as people who bothered to come out on a Wednesday Thursday evening to City Lights. And it's just such a special joy to be here at City Lights because were it not for City Lights, my own adolescence would be considerably diminished because I began coming to this store at the age of about 13 in 1965. And I discovered on its shelves, as I did about a decade later, when I had the fortune of spending a summer living in Susan Sontag's penthouse apartment at 340 Riverside Drive in New York, working with an author, Robert Scheer, as it happens, who was finishing writing a book about America's multinational corporations. And I remember getting a crick in my neck as I had gotten as an adolescent here at City Lights, looking at all the titles of books and authors representing all these dreams and stories. And then going to college and graduating and discovering when I spent that summer at Susan Sontag's apartment, much as I had discovered here at City Lights, that my real education was just beginning. There were rows and rows, scores upon scores, hundreds of books by authors I'd never heard of. Some I had heard of but never read. And I really thought my real education was beginning. And I remember there's an essay in the book in which I try to evoke Susan Sontag, the woman I knew, and her cultural avidity. And I remember in that summer of 74, seeing on her shelves 4 blue-backed volumes, the journals of the great French writer André Gide. And I managed to find a page which he had committed to his diary in the late 20s or very early 30s, in which he wrote, and this was lightly underlined in Susan's pencil, "I know I shall have entered old age the moment I awaken and no longer feel outrage." And that seemed for me to sum up in a nutshell the great animating inspiration that was unleashed, the energy that was unleashed in the Berkeley that I knew when I came of age. And for me, it's been a kind of lodestar providing true north ever since.
You know what you said about Susan Sontag's apartment? I think there are 2 kinds of intimidation. One is seeing on somebody's shelves the books of writers you heard of and haven't read, and the other is seeing the writers you've never heard of and haven't read. Let me just read a paragraph you wrote about Sontag, and then I want to ask you a little more about her. "This space harbored the writer's elixir that I believed would be mine if I were to drink it all up at Chez Sontag. I admired the way this girl from the San Fernando Valley and from the outskirts of Phoenix had invented herself, had read her way through the great books, and had become a fearless Joan of Arc of the higher seriousness. It was a space that I too wanted to inhabit." You know, when we think about Sontag, we forget that she did come from the West. Do you think that sort of explains her brilliance in a way, that she transplanted herself? Because very often people who do creative things, they've come from somewhere else in the space and then do them in a different space.
There are many people in New York who we think of as dyed-in-the-wool New Yorkers, but actually were immigrants from elsewhere, who, growing up in their small rural towns, were desperate to find others of similar bent who shared their curiosities, and they couldn't find those people in the small towns that they grew up. So they were desperate to shed the chrysalis that had so suffocated and constrained their ambitions. And New York was, for many reasons, some good, some less good, was a magnetic pole that attracted to its city aspiring people of all kinds. It's the subject in Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie and a number of his other books, which is the story of rural folk who are harbor outsized ambitions and who want to test themselves against this teeming metropolis where it is possible that ambition and smarts and the street moxie and hustle, you could reinvent yourself. But the great call of California and the West also harbored such an aspiration as well. In fact, Susan Sontag once remarked that California was America's America. And by that, I took her to mean that just as people fled the suffocations and persecutions of Europe and wanted to slip the noose of history, weighing, as a great philosopher once put it, like a nightmare on the brain of the living, fled to the New World, in which they thought they could somehow avoid Europe's narrowness. And so too, people fled the industrializing cities of the East Coast, coming to California, which they mistakenly thought was uninhabited. Of course, there were people called the indigenous who were here, who were then subjected to ruthless extermination campaigns in the mid-19th century. But suddenly, as one historian wrote, the world flooded in. And famously, Hollywood is perhaps California's California, where it was a magnet for people all over the world hoping to shed the weight of history and reinvent themselves. So the American project of reinvention is deeply baked into the DNA of not only ordinary people, but also of its intellectuals. And it is remarkable, it seems to me, as I made my way seeking to create something of a career in New York publishing, how many editors I encountered who were actually, when you got them over 2 martinis at a lunch, confessed, oh, I went to Long Beach High School. I'm from Sacramento. Oh, I actually went to North Hollywood High School and grew up in Tucson. And it was astonishing. I once tried to, on a flight back from New York to California, I took a yellow legal pad and started writing down the names of all the people I had encountered or had heard of that were from elsewhere. I stopped at about 150.
Wow. Let me read you something that you wrote about somebody else who came from elsewhere. And then I want to ask you about him. This is from a lovely piece in the book called Dear Hitch, about Christopher Hitchens. A dozen years gone, dear Christopher, and not a day goes by that I don't think of you. Boon companion, peerless writer, stalwart friend. We had so much fun dreaming up God is Not Great, Hitchens' book about religion, debating fiercely till wee hours of the morning all the issues of the day, sharpening our rhetorical arrows and stashing them in our respective quivers, looking forward to letting them fly at deserving targets, large and small. So Hitchens was a pretty big figure in your life, it seems.
Yes.
And tell us about that. And then there's some specific things I want to ask about him.
I met him in October 1979. I had been working as deputy editor of the Los Angeles Times opinion section. I found myself on a well-deserved holiday, or at least I thought it was well-deserved holiday in London for the first time. And I went to see a writer who had been writing op-ed pieces for me from time to time, the great Robin Blackburn, who was one of the presiding editors and contributors to the New Left Review. I was in great sympathy with the New Left Review's project, seeking to sort of how to put it, reassemble the shards of a beleaguered Marxism and try to make sense of a world in upheaval, and often concentrating on areas of the world and countries that, like so many of those writers, I had barely heard of, but they seemed to slice and dice in a granular way with great erudition, the kind of erudition that comes from a superb English education, these various places with due and proportionate attention to class as well as gender, race, and economics, and all informed by wit. And Hitchens was an occasional contributor. And so I went to see Robin Blackburn, and he said after a couple of hours conversation, why don't we have lunch together? I know a really bad Chinese restaurant, and I know a guy who I think you'd really get on with. His name's Christopher Hitchens, and he writes for the New Statesman. He's the foreign editor of the New Statesman. So he rang Hitchens up. Christopher said he was free to join us. And all I remember about that lunch was that, yes, the pot stickers were really lousy, but the conversation was scintillating, and I fell in love. I fell in love. And soon Christopher was writing for me regularly. Then in 1981, he came at Victor Navasky, then the publisher of The Nation's invitation to become Washington-based columnist for The Nation. And we became, and then later I became publisher of an imprint at Farrar, Straus and Giroux called Hill and Wang. And I began to publish his first works here in the United States. We became fast friends. I introduced him to the woman, an old friend of mine who I'd known since she was 19, who became Christopher's second wife, inadvertently breaking up his first marriage. But hey, everybody's got agency here, and so what can I say? And by the end, I was holding his hand when he died at the all too young age of 62 of esophageal cancer, 12 years ago.
Let me ask you one thing about Hitchens, which has always sort of puzzled me and bothered me. He was absolutely brilliant. He knew everything. He never forgot a word that he read and could summon it up years later. But I always was a little bothered by the fact that he never really acknowledged when he changed his mind dramatically about something. For example, the war in Iraq. And do you feel that was a flaw of his?
We had many disagreements. Iraq was one of them. He preferred to call the growing American intervention in that part of the world, he liked to call it Mesopotamia. It had a quaint sound to it. And our disagreements were quite principled. Our friendship did not break over it. He felt he was being loyal to a universalizing creed that was opposed to totalitarianism and despotism. And his view, which he articulated with tremendous eloquence, was that the United States, which had done so much to prop up the despotic vampirism of Saddam Hussein, had so enfeebled the suffering Iraqi people that the United States owed a blood debt to the Iraqi people, who unfortunately were not in a position any longer to actually mount a successful resistance to this monster, Saddam Hussein. And while it was true that the United States, for its own reasons, decided to invade Iraq, Hitchens felt that that was reason enough to free the Iraqis as well as the Kurds from this vicious tyrant. And just as you would have seen during the Second World War, an alliance between the capitalist powers and indeed the Soviet Union in an effort to topple the National Socialism of Hitler, so too was it possible to imagine an alliance between otherwise fierce enemies in this great project. He articulated it with tremendous force, and I felt he would be on the wrong side of history for a variety of reasons. That even if the United States were successful in doing this, you would have deprived the Iraqi people of agency, and sometimes people need to actually make their own history and not have it made for others. But these were very principled disagreements, and often people who were opposed to Christopher's views tended to dismiss them because they thought they were basically the product of an alcoholic riddled mind. And I thought that was an easy way to dismiss the actual arguments. I was around Christopher for many, many years. He could drink like nobody's business, but I never saw him become diminished intellectually. And he was famous for delivering his articles in perfect sentences on deadline, even after a whole night of drinking. Now, where I did, if I may be permitted, just to go on a little bit longer here, I had invited him to, at the Los Angeles Festival of Books, to be on a panel. And I had been noticing that his vehemence with respect to arguing a number of these very controversial positions had devolved in a way in which, when there were questions from the audience, he would often become so irritated or even angered that his usual eloquence would leave him, and he would descend into a kind of bullying profanity. And he was the one who once told me, the moment someone either has recourse to an analogy of Hitler or begins to curse, you've lost the argument. So I took him aside at a dinner in which I introduced him to his fellow atheist, Sam Harris. And I took him aside and I said, Christopher, as your friend, I even go so far to say your comrade, and now as your literary agent, I'd like to give you a piece of advice. I noticed that you're in danger of losing the audience when your arguments devolve in this way. And I wonder if you could somehow avoid doing so. I think it would be to your advantage. And he looked at me with a kind of schoolboy's contrition and said, Steve, in those dulcet tones that were imperishable, Steve, I recognize the man you describe. What can I say? I'll do my best, but I think I may fail upward.
I hate to make the analogy, but I happened to see the Trump movie last night, and one of the principal characters is, of course, Roy Cohn, who's one of the lessons he gives to the young Donald is never admit a mistake. And I felt that was Christopher's fatal flaw, that because I think he did come to feel that he had maybe made a mistake or misjudgment or partial misjudgment on the Iraq War, but I would have loved to see him explore that in print, and I don't think he ever did.
I never heard Christopher apologize or express error either privately or publicly. I think it was a flaw.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think he felt that he was wrong on Iraq. I don't think he did. Everybody else was wrong, but not him.
Although he didn't he vote? He voted for Obama in 2008, right?
I believe he did. Yes.
Yes.
I was
sort of acknowledging.
Yeah, I was at Christopher's house when in the Obama inauguration.
Yeah.
And I believe he did vote for Obama.
So that's sort of acknowledging that he was wrong. Would have loved to have seen him explore that in print. Anyway, let's move on. God, I've got so many things to ask you here. We could go on for hours and hours, but let me come next to one of the pieces in here which I particularly liked because it very much went against the grain of what was in the air at that time and is still to some extent in the air now. And I'm talking about your very critical article about the Black Panthers. Tell us a bit about how that came about. You must have gotten a lot of flack for it when it was published. I'd love to hear about that.
Well, first of all, throughout this book, I treat a lot of large and some small political and cultural phenomena. I very often have some skin in the game. These things were quite personal to me. I grew up in Berkeley High School in 1968, 2 years after the Black Panther Party was founded in October of 66 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. In April of 1968, as you will doubtless recall, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. In the week following, I organized the white kids of this 3,200 pupil school, and my great friend Ronnie Stevenson, African-American, who was the founding chair of the Black Student Union and an early recruit to the Panther Party, the two of us led a student strike. He organizing the African-American kids, me, the white kids, and we went out on strike.
What year was this again?
1968.
Okay.
April 1968. And we had a single, as we called it then, non-negotiable demand. And our non-negotiable demand was the insistence that an African-American Studies and History Department be founded. To our amazement, the Berkeley School Board acceded to this demand. The only disagreement that Ronnie Stevenson and I had was he felt that the course should be an elective course. I felt it should be mandatory because in any proper curricula, Black history would simply be a part of American history. And I said, if you only make it a voluntary course, only the Black kids are going to enroll in it. And arguably, this history is as necessary, if not more so, for the white kids. Because after all, how could you consider yourself a educated person if what, you only knew the speeches of Abraham Lincoln, but you didn't know the speeches of Frederick Douglass? No, you have to know it all. So the next year, and I duly enrolled in that course in the fall. I still have on my books assigned reading Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Before the Mayflower and Basil Davidson's The African Genius, among other important books. The next year, 1969, we, in our radical mischievousness, me and a kind of posse of kids, decided to publish an underground high school newspaper. And Bobby Seale, who I'd come to know, permitted us to use the typesetting equipment upstairs in the Black Panther Party national headquarters, which was then on Shattuck Avenue. And, we would enter and we'd get patted down and we'd go past the sandbags. We'd go upstairs and we were kind of adopted as their mascots or something. I had a great friend named Jeffrey Scales, who for the last 30 years has worked as the photography editor for the New York Times. Well, he was the youngest African-American photographer. And many of the photographs that you see that are famous of the Panther Party members of that time. There's Stephen Shames. There are a number of people. Jeffrey Scales was among them. So I had very good friends. I went to the Huey Newton trial with my sister in August of 1968. 2 years later, in August of 1970, I was among the 5,000 people who stood on that very sunny day when Newton was released from prison and stood atop a car, tore off his shirt, revealing at the age of 26 what happens to a person if they're in prison and they do 10,000 push-ups a week. Enormously, he had become a living embodiment of the emblem of the party. But I was also aware, as time went on, that this rising party was also subject to some very discreditable things that in movement circles in Berkeley were the subject of the higher and lower gossip, but they were not the subject of investigations or in print. We all knew about Eldridge Cleaver's misogyny. We all knew about, it was common knowledge that he
beat up his wife,
Kathleen. We all knew about his philandering. We knew so we knew about the gap between the ideals of some of the party members and their idealism. And over the course of time, some of this became not just the butt of jokes or something. This was serious stuff because people were being killed. In the midst of all of this, you have the relentless program by COINTELPRO and the FBI and the state to harass and worse and set one faction against the other. I went to the Chicago 8 trial, as it was first called. I recount it in the book. I walk in to the Leonard Weinglass, who was one of the defense attorneys, and his apartment was being used as a kind of crash pad for these nomadic allies that would come into town and try to organize around the party. And I was at that party when at midnight, Fred Hampton, all of 21, as handsome as all get out, looking like nothing more like a sort of gunslinger coming into the saloon, although the soundtrack was the newly released Beatles' Abbey Road. And I remember when he came in, there was a cloud of pot smoke and Here Comes the Sun was on it. 3 weeks later, he was shot and murdered in his bed by a informant and murdered. So it was a terrible time. And I think that my essay was written to review a book called Black Against Empire by two scholars. And they do many good things in the book, but they also allow themselves to succumb to the seductions of the party to the detriment of, in my view, a proportionate and unsentimental analysis of all the factors that combined, many of them self-inflicted, to lead to the demise and disgrace of a good deal of what the party had tried to stand for. And I try to end that essay, as you'll recall, by shifting the spotlight from what I call the supernovas of the party, the Eldred Cleavers, the Bobby Seals, the Huey Newtons, that really sucked up all the oxygen in the room, and try to talk about some of the people that did not have national reputations, like my friend Ronnie Stevenson, and what they did and what they were inspired by. Because I think the legacy, while mixed, has to be seen in a proportionate way. Did I get a lot of pushback from criticism? No, I got several letters from ex-Black Panthers, some in Texas, some elsewhere, saying, "You told the truth, brother." I got a letter from Betty Van Patter's daughter,
who's a close friend of mine.
Yes, yeah. She sent a very heartfelt letter.
This is the daughter of a woman who was murdered by the Panthers. Yeah.
So, and I think still to be written is a more just and proportionate reckoning with the party's mixed legacy, and that work remains to be done.
Yeah. Okay, good. I want to turn to something else. You have worked in journalism or publishing your entire life. You've worked for a newspaper, the Los Angeles Times. You've worked for publishing houses. And even as a book publisher, you're acutely aware of newspapers because they review books and often help books live or die by what they do. And, we're in a tremendous crisis in American journalism right now. The number of newspapers has shrunk dramatically. The circulation of those that have survived has still shrunk. The nature of news has changed, because of the internet, which has speeded everything up. There's so many facets of that we could talk about. And we were chatting just before this began about the way the internet has led to a sort of surfeit of opinion out there. You actually worked at the opinion section at one point at the LA Times. Could you ever imagine yourself doing that today?
No.
Yeah.
First of all, I used to be the editor of the Los Angeles Times Book Review when it had a book review. Some years ago, they put a bullet to its head. Yeah. There's only one newspaper now that publishes a separate standalone book review section. It's called the New York Times. Mm-hmm. Everybody else, no. Book coverage has shrunk, which I think is a great betrayal. I mean, if it's true that journalism, as the cliche has it, is the first draft of history, then where is the histories being written? They're in the books. Well, if the newspapers aren't going to at least bring you the news of the things that stay news, then they have somehow failed in an essential obligation. But I'm not a doom and gloom person. Yes, the internet is a vast democracy wall in which every crank can post his or her manifesto. The coin of the realm, however, is devalued by the millions and billions who are seeking to slice and dice and find a reader here and there, and the velocity of everything enfeebles the solitude so necessary so that people could actually have a space to think and come to something that might resemble wisdom. On the other hand, we're here in this bookstore, which does not have the square footage to accommodate all the very worthwhile books that are actually being published. I think it's actually, despite all the merger mania that has gone on in publishing, despite the consolidation, despite the fact there are 4 or 5 mainstream big publishers, I think it's a golden age. I really do. There are more books or book-like objects being manufactured today than in the whole of human history. There is a book, I almost think that no book, however mediocre, goes unpublished. You would need several lifetimes over doing nothing but lying prone in a semi-illuminated room to read your way through the good books on offer, not to mention the worthy dead. So I really think there's more diversity, both of subject matter and of authors. Has it always been hard? Yes. Are there stupid gatekeepers? Yes. But technology has democratized the means of production. It is possible, and it's within the budget of almost anyone to have a book-like object, almost indistinguishable from my own book, manufactured, put in your garage, put in your station wagon, and try to fob it off on family and close friends. The problem is distribution. That has the shrinking number of bookstores, although I note that in recent years, despite the pandemic, the number of independent bookstores have rebounded. There are at least 1,500, about 1,500 more than there were 10 years ago.
1,500 more than
yeah.
there were 10 years ago.
Whatever the figure was, and I have the figure there were about 4,000 independent bookstores. I'm rounding the numbers up a little bit. That was about halved due to Amazon and other competitors and the rise of real estate, a number of factors. But that 2,000 is now upwards of around 3,200 now. They've rebounded. And, these bookstores, the ecosystem of bookselling, and Heyday, which is the publisher I preside over for the past 8 years, is celebrating this year its 50th year in business as an independent nonprofit. And I must say the last 5 years have been the most robust sales in our 50-year history. We've managed actually even to raise staff salaries, an unheard of thing. And to expand what we're doing, hopefully in a prudent way. But I am quite excited, and I think independent presses in particular are flourishing because they don't suffer from the burdensome overhead that the mainstream publishers are afflicted with, and we can be more nimble, and our choices can be more daring, precisely because while we have great risks, we are not hostage to the overhead and the profit motive that so many of the big publishers are. So it gives us a lot of freedom.
Well, it's encouraging. I want to ask you one more question on this subject, and then maybe it's time some of you here or online have questions. If not, I've got lots more myself. Still in the realm of journalism, book publishing, the journalism part of it, the newspapers and publications that remain, and by publications now, we are increasingly talking about the internet, and even the so-called legacy publications, magazines like the New Yorker and the Atlantic and so on, publish a vastly greater amount of material on the internet than they do in print. One criticism that has been made is that because of the internet, the kind of people who get hired to work at newspapers, magazines, and so forth tend to be people who got their training as bloggers, rather than in the old days when, there used to be 15 daily newspapers within commuting distance of San Francisco, rather than training as newspaper reporters, actually going out on stories, interviewing people, reporting the news. Is that something you feel, or would you disagree with that diagnosis?
I would accept your characterization. I didn't come up that way. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you look at my resume, so generously cited by Peter in his opening introduction, you might conclude that I haven't been able to hold a job for very long, and I have sort of floated from one thing to the next. And either that's because I get bored a little bit too easily, or I lost patience. And one of the things that interested me when I worked, I had this whole fantasy when I was fortunate enough to be hired at the Los Angeles Times, not as a reporter, but as an assistant editor on the op-ed page. I was all of 26 years old. And I had this idea that because it was a mass metropolitan daily newspaper with a Sunday circulation at that time in 1978, you'll forgive the expression, of 1.2, 1.3 million on Sundays,
And
right?
that was printed newspapers.
Printed
Yeah.
newspapers, printed newspapers. I had this idea that as a person in the catbird seat at the op-ed page, that because of me and my particular temperament and interests, I might be able to get voices onto that page that might not otherwise have been heard. Voices like an I.F. Stone, Gloria Emerson, wonderful Robin Blackburn, right? Who were otherwise sort of condemned to the ghettos of the smaller opinion magazines of whatever political persuasion, whether it was The Nation or, and I had sort of had it with these publications that I was too easily ready to dismiss as basically appealing only to people who had already been converted to their point of view. And I thought the great excitement of a mass circulation newspaper is I was going to get opinions in front of so-called ordinary people. Now, so I get this job and I discover something that I had never suspected before. At the risk of a generalization, no fresh or original idea has ever been first published in the pages of a mass metropolitan daily newspaper. That is not what they do. No, I discovered that like their brethren in Hollywood, the writers in the Los Angeles Times had no original ideas of their own. They were desperate to find ideas. So they would canvass the smaller magazines, opinion journals, whether it was William F. Buckley's National Review, or whether it was Victor Navasky's The Nation, desperate for an idea. And if they found that idea, they would then popularize it, much like the newspapers, those that remain, do today. When you read the Science Times section of the New York Times, you will often see in a lead story by David Overby or other distinguished and very good reporters, as the journal Nature will disclose in the forthcoming issue. And what they do is they take the discoveries and the news from elsewhere, they put it into a more popular language for a larger audience that's trying to stay informed. And it reminded me that I had a much more acute sense of how ideas circulate in the culture. I'll give you one example that was very telling for me. I don't know if you remember Charles Murray, the loathsome Charles Murray, who wrote a book called Losing Ground, in which a consortium of right-wing think tanks, including the Koch brothers as well as others, had funded the effort to investigate and critique the country's social welfare system and the safety net that it provided. And Charles Murray argued in a book published by Basic that basically argued shred the net. Yes, some people will flop around and disappear, but net, it's going to be a good thing. We're going to save money and people will buck up and get on with their lives and we'll save a lot of money. That was the essence of the argument. I happen to know because I was then the editor of New Republic Books, which was a co-publishing venture with Basic. And I saw the contract. The contract was for an advance of $2,000, which even in 1982 was, a paltry amount of money, $2,000. However, the Hudson Institute and a couple of right-wing think tanks gave him fellowships and other grants that he got so that he could still afford his apartment on the Upper West Side, take his kids to the movie and his wife out to dinner from time to time. And he could, because what it occurred to me is that the right wing had a greater appreciation, curiously, more than the left, that ideas mattered, or at least they mattered at that moment. They may not matter at all now. We live in such a caricatured world. At any rate, so this book is published in a first printing of only a few thousand copies. However, Marty Peretz at the New Republic and the then editor, Michael Kinsley, and Rick Hertzberg together, they sponsored a debate over this book. And several pages of the New Republic were devoted. Now, the New Republic had a circulation then probably of about 60,000 or so. And then suddenly the other people at CBS News and Ted Koppel at Nightline and Newsweek and Time, which were then, larger forces than today, suddenly op-ed editorials and pieces began percolating all over the country, citing this book. And suddenly there was the popularization, and the scales fell from my eyes about how ideas get generated in the culture, start to circulate, and then begin to influence the larger culture. So I had a renewed respect for the smaller magazines. And I didn't think at that time that the end all and be all, now I don't speak here about the reporting, the kind of going to the board of super, how does power actually work? Those kinds of things, those investigative things, which need money, which need time, and they need reporting skills. But on the opinion side, I was really thunderstruck by all of that. And so that is why, after 5 years at the LA Times, I decided to take a pay cut when the job was offered to me to head up New Republic Books. My father thought I was crazy. He said, it's not supposed to work like that. You're not supposed to go from $34,000 a year, which is what I was being paid in 1983, to $32,500 at the New Republic. But I said to him, but Dad, what you don't realize is this is the tether by which I'm going to swing in to the East Coast. And it's not about this job. It's about the job after this. And I had this odd romantic idea that I wanted to test myself against the best that New York offered.
I think maybe it's time to see if any of you have questions you'd like to ask Steve, or any of those of you online.
Steve, could you talk about the title? There's a really great story attached to that.
I wonder what the story is that you recall from the book. I have a couple of different ways I've thought about the title. The title is Tell Me Something, Tell Me Anything, even if it's a lie. This was said to me 54 years ago. I was 17. It was said to me by a poet named Pablo Armando Fernandez, who, after a lot of rum on a Cuban beach, I was in Cuba cutting sugarcane with nearly 700 other Americans in order to demonstrate that we Americans had a right to visit a country that was being pilloried and blockaded by the United States, and they had a right to fashion their own future. And I thought, what a great line that is. And if I would ever have the talent of, say, a Chekhov, maybe I could turn that into a short story, or maybe it would be the epigraph of a novel, or maybe it would be the title of one of the longer essays in this book about Cuba, a place I've gone to a dozen times or so over the last 50 years with increasing heartbreak. And it's really a title that, as I thought about it, seemed to inform a good deal of the story that I'm trying to tell in this book. Oscar Wilde once said that no man should be trusted whose dictionary does not boast the word utopia. And as I've gotten older, I have sadly concluded that you probably shouldn't trust anyone whose dictionary does include the word utopia, because no such place ever existed. And given the fact that we are, as another philosopher once said, the broken timber of humanity, it is quite unlikely we will ever enjoy such a place where all contradictions will be resolved, and the sun will always shine, and all will be well and just and equitable. Nonetheless, it doesn't relieve us from the obligation to behave as if such a thing as might be possible. Because if we were to relinquish this notion, this comforting conceit, perhaps even this lie, then the whole meaning of our existence would be leached out of us, and we might risk a terrible and deforming complacency. So I play with this notion throughout the book, the tension between what you need to do to get up in the morning and fight the good fight, and a more sober recognition of the challenges that doing so entail.
Thank you for that. Anyone here?
No.
Okay. Oh, here we go. Oops, sorry.
Steve, you're as eloquent speaking as you are writing. I don't like critiques that wish the author or the director had included something else,
Having what? Excuse me.
included something else
Mhm.
that they didn't write about. But I did have that feeling with this wonderful book. I didn't find anything in it about what to me has been a really important social movement for the last 60 years, namely feminism. And I'm wondering what you think about feminism. Have you written about it? And it's not in here, but I'm just wondering where you are about that particular enormous force.
I'm for it. I have not written about many things. A startling omission in this book is, despite a lifelong love of and an indispensable attachment to music, there's nothing in this book about music. Very sad, actually, when I think about it, because I am very passionate and cannot imagine a day without music. It's been a very important part of my life. Feminism. I was one of the authors of the 11-point program of the Berkeley High School Radical Student Union. We issued our demands in the fall of 1969, for which we were suspended. We were a group of about 7 or 8 high school students, about half of us women, half boys. Point number 7 called for the liberation of women, and the high school underground paper that we ran called Pack Rat had quite a lot of articles about that. So it's certainly a question that, of course, with respect to feminism, as with respect to all social movements, there are differences of opinion within that. If by a certain feminism you mean equal pay for equal work, dignity, respect, women's right to control their own body, blah, 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 yes, no question. There is a very significant profile of Susan Sontag, who was much pilloried and criticized, partly in her lifetime and certainly by some upon her death, for not ever having been an out lesbian. And indeed, I wrote her obituary at the Los Angeles Times, and was confronted in the stairwell by 2 women reporters, gay they happened to be, who were very unhappy with me because I had failed to mention Susan Sontag's long relationship with Annie Leibovitz. So we had a frank conversation in which I said I knew Susan very well. And Susan did regard herself as a feminist, but she felt her private life, her sexual life, was her business and no one else's. And she never wrote about it. She never made it a subject of thing. And I said, I wasn't writing the obituary. I wasn't writing a biography. I think a biographer would have a different and appropriately a need to include much about a person that the person had kept private if it shed light on the life itself. However, in a newspaper, I was trying to address, why should we even give this person any public attention? What was important about her life? And for me, it was her writings. It was the effect she had on the culture. And I said to the 2 women who confronted me, I said, by the way, I dare say I know a great deal more about Susan Sontag than you do. If I were to write about her love affair with Annie Leibovitz, so too should I talk about the time I came out of Chez Panisse and found her in the arms making out with Jean-Pierre Gorin, Godard's focus puller? Should I talk about her love affair, her carnal love affair with the late poet Joseph Brodsky, and other things? I think, people are complicated. So yes, there is no piece in this book that talks about feminism as such. but I would hope that a close reading of the book would reveal in my citation of whether it's Margaret Fuller or my evocation of Sontag, my devotion to championing the project that I think is true of all of us, whatever our gender, which is to realize our full human potential and to throw off the suffocations and gender and class-based impositions that societies overall seek to impose on all of us. But yes, I tended to write for money. That is to say, at the invitation of this or that editor, whether at The Nation or these other magazines, I'm old-fashioned enough to have felt that I didn't want to give it away for free.
Mr. Hochschild, do you want to maybe try a couple?
Steve, tell us the Orson Welles story, but don't give away the last line till you get there.
So let me check the time for a second here. 8 o'clock. Okay, we're good. In 1979, I was deputy editor of the LA Times Sunday Opinion section. I awakened one morning and saw on page 19, buried in the newspaper, that the great film director Jean Renoir had died in Beverly Hills. And the LA Times, as it were the paper of record for Hollywood, had buried the obituary using an AP Associated Press wire story on page 19. I was 26, something of a cinephile. I was outraged. I came into the office. I turned to my colleague and boss, Tim Rutten, who was barely older than I was. He was 5 years older than I was, but he affected patches on his elbows. He smoked a pipe. You could smoke a pipe then. And he comported himself like an adult. And all my life, I wanted to be an adult, but I never felt I was an adult, even when I got to the ages of these adults. Anyway, I come to him. I'm full of outrage. We have to do something. And he looks at me and he says, yes, you're absolutely right. Well, but we should commission a piece for the Sunday Opinion section. We should do a proper remembrance and talk about what was so important about Jean Renoir. And he said, well, who could write this piece? And for reasons wholly mysterious to me, I blurt out Orson Welles. And kind of remembering, yes, in Citizen Kane, Greg Toland, his great cinematographer, had done deep focus photography, and Renoir had pioneered it many years before in Rules of the Game. And at any rate, so he says, great, Orson Welles, do you know him? And I said, no, I don't know him at all. Well, do you know how to find him or get to him? And I thought, no, not really. And then I sort of remember, well, he has a regular table at the fashionable restaurant Ma Maison at near Melrose and Robertson. But it was Monday. We can't wait till Wednesday. We need the piece by Thursday if we have a prayer of getting it into the paper. So I go back to my desk and I think, oh yeah, I remember it was Orson Welles who was the voice who intoned for Paul Maison Winery, no wine before its time. So I call the winery and they refer me to an ad agency in New York. I call the ad agency. They refer me to someone they say is Welles' New York agent. I call this guy. I identify myself. I say what I'm calling for. And he says, and it was like straight out of, the apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz or something. He says and he could tell I was young by my voice. And he says, kid, so you want to reach Orson Welles, do you? I said, yes, I would be so grateful if you could point me in a direction. And he says, a lot of us want to reach Orson Welles. And let me tell you, he said, I'm going to give you a telephone number. And I actually have, and it's not in the book, but I recently came across in a article that Gore Vidal wrote 5 years after Welles' death, or 5 years after Welles' death. He wrote a piece remembering Welles in which he said, I still have his telephone number. And at any rate, it would be too delayed. Anyway, he tells us story. So the agent says, take down this number. This is the number of his office. 213. Yes, a local area code. 213-598-2649. And if you, by chance, reach Mr. Welles, which I very much doubt you will, could you tell him to call his agent, for crying out loud? So I ring the number. Forgive me, this story has to go a little bit longer. 213. After what felt like an innumerable amount of rings, the phone is picked up very slowly, like remember Lars or whatever it was from Dark Shadows or something, very slowly. And what I have to describe accurately as a fey voice at the other end answers, hello, and identify myself. I says, is this Mr. Wells' office? Yes. Is Mr. Wells there? No. The tones of great exasperation. Identify myself. I tell him why I'm calling. And I said, could you take a message? Yes. This is could you tell him to call Steve Wasserman? And this is my number. And he says, Mr. Wasserman, I want to tell you something. Yes, this is Mr. Wells' office. Mr. Wells rarely comes into this office. And when he does, he often sees this great stack of pink slips. And he looks at the pink slips and he sweeps them to the floor. So I will leave the message, but whether he calls you back or not, it's not on me. Next morning, I get to the office bright and early. At my desk is seated the ultimate boss, Anthony Day, the editor of the editorial pages. And he's phone to his ear. He's going, yes, 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 no, excuse me. Yes, I see him now. Hold on a moment. Covers the mouthpiece, looks at me, his face rearranging itself like a cubist painting. He looks at me and he says, Steve, it's Orson Welles for you. It's like an employee's dream. I take the phone and I hear in those unmistakable tones, Mr. Wasserman, this is Orson Welles. I did not know until your kind note that my great and good friend, Jean Renoir, had passed. What, pray tell, would you have me do? So I said, wow, this page 19 is complete outrage, AP Wire story, one of the great figures. I mean, we got to do something here. And he says, so you need an article. Yes, it would be great. How long a piece? And he says, how about 250 words? I say, well, Mr. Wells, given the longevity of the life and its accomplishment, this is on the short side. I was thinking something more along the lines of 1,000 words. Why don't we split the difference at 500? I said, okay, that's fine. And then I say, as for deadline, and he says, no, I know you needed it yesterday. I said, well, for you, Mr. Wells, the day after tomorrow would really, be very helpful. And then I say, now, as for compensation, and our compensation for an op-ed piece was $150, which had not changed in 150 years. I say, and as for compensation, and I hear the following boom back at me, now, let us not sully the talk of art with talk of cobbers. I trust you will do the right thing, won't you, young man? Oh, well, Mr. Wells, I'll do my very best. I know you will. So I hang up. The deadline of the next day comes and goes. The next day, Thursday, it comes and goes. Fine, we're holding open space on the pages, and finally, I get a call at the last possible moment from the ex-Cuban security guard in the lobby of the Los Angeles Times, a lobby that looks something like the Daily Planet. It has a revolving Art Deco globe, whose map has not been changed since the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, it was one of the great things. And he calls me. He says, a man who says he's from Mr. Wells' office has something for you, and he says he can only give it to you. So I run down the stairwell, and I kid you not, I come. There's a driver kitted out in livery, and there's like a limousine from like Sunset Boulevard outside the things, and he hands me a manila envelope, and I walk up the stairwell. I don't take the elevator. I take it out, and there, triple spaced, typed on 11 pages, is his piece, typed on what looked like an Underwood 5 manual typewriter, edited in a blue felt pen, and on the last page signed Orson Welles. It's not 500 words. It's not 1,000 words. It's 2,000 words. And it's an extraordinary essay And do you want me to just stop there? Or,
going.
okay. And I start to read it. And the lead, the paragraph, as near as I can recall, begins something like this. There are many people in Hollywood who were very pleased to hang the dead Renoir on their walls. But as for the living Renoir, they paid him no mind. And as I read it, more and more, it seemed to me to be a piece, of course, all about Orson Welles, all about himself, all about the neglect that he'd suffered. And it was a piece, a profound piece about the uneasy intersection of art and commerce. It was the last piece he ever wrote. We published it in February 18th, 1979. You can look it up. Go on the internet. It's a great piece.
And then he died, what, a couple?
He died
years-
about 4 years later.
Yeah.
At the age, and I mean, I'm startled to look at this because I'm 2 years older now than he was when he died, 70.
Okay.
Now you don't have to buy the book because I have really told you that chapter. But I urge you, lest we let the evening go without any significant self-promotion, this is the story of the unfolding and discovery of a sensibility that tried to inhale the world. I've left lots of the world out of it. Doesn't include everything, but it includes enough so that you, the reader, can fill in the blanks, because no writer's work is ever done without the reader. Otherwise, it just lies inert and in something of a coma on the shelves. So I think you'll enjoy it. I hope you will. I want to thank you for listening.